30 seconds. That was how long it took for my husband to decide that my entire future depended on him. At the time, he thought it was just another argument, just another night where he would raise his voice, I would stay quiet, and eventually, the house would fall back into silence. But what he didn't understand was that those 30 seconds would end our marriage. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 38 years old, and until last year, I had spent nearly 15 years believing my husband knew what was best for our life. Before we continue, one small note. This story is an original narrative created for this channel. It's inspired by real relationship dynamics and told with the intention of exploring the emotional realities many people quietly experience behind closed doors. Now back to that night. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt garlic. I had left the pan on the stove a little too long while trying to finish a spreadsheet on my laptop at the dining table. The clock above the refrigerator read 9:42 p.m. Mark was leaning against the counter with a glass of bourbon in his hand, watching me with the same expression he'd worn more often over the last few years. Half amusement, half irritation. "You're still working on that thing?" he asked. I didn't look up immediately. "It's for a freelance client," I said calmly. "They need revisions by tomorrow morning." Mark gave a quiet laugh. Not the kind people make when something is actually funny. The other kind. The one that says they already believe you're wasting your time. "Freelance," he repeated slowly. "Claire, you make a couple $100 from those little projects. That's not a career." I closed the laptop halfway and looked at him. For a moment, I thought about explaining again. About telling him that the small projects were starting to grow. About mentioning the email I had received earlier that afternoon. But I already knew how the conversation would go. So instead, I said nothing. Mark took another sip of his drink and continued. "You know what the problem is?" he said. I didn't answer. He walked around the counter and set the glass down on the table beside my laptop. "You spend all your time pretending you're building something," he said, "but the truth is that you're not." The words hung in the air. Outside, a car passed slowly down our street, its headlights sliding across the living room wall. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. Not anger, not even sadness. Just that quiet feeling that comes when you realize someone has been underestimating you for a very long time. "You could stop all this tomorrow," Mark continued. "Just focus on the house. Things would be easier." "Easier for who?" I asked softly. He shrugged. "For both of us." The kitchen fell silent again. In the early years of our marriage, Mark hadn't been like this. Or maybe he had been, and I just hadn't noticed yet. Back then, he used to talk about our future like we were building something together. But somewhere along the way, that changed. His job in commercial real estate had started doing well. The promotions came quickly, the paychecks got bigger, and slowly, almost without either of us saying it out loud, our roles inside the marriage began shifting. Mark became the provider, and I became everything else. The house, the schedules, the errands, the quiet person in the background who made sure everything worked. At first, I told myself it was temporary. But temporary things have a strange way of becoming permanent. Mark pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "You know what really worries me?" he said. I looked up. "That if something ever happened to me," he continued, "you wouldn't have any idea how to survive." The words landed heavier than he probably expected. I studied his face carefully. He wasn't trying to hurt me, not intentionally. He genuinely believed what he was saying, and that realization made the moment strangely calm. "You think I couldn't manage?" I asked. Mark leaned back in the chair. "Claire," he said, shaking his head slightly, "you wouldn't last a week without me." There it was, the sentence that ended everything, not because he yelled it, not because he meant it as an insult, but because he said it so casually, so confidently, as if it were simply a fact. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Mark seemed satisfied with the silence, like someone who had just finished explaining something obvious. I should have argued. I should have defended myself. But instead, I just sat there, thinking. Because the truth was, earlier that afternoon, something had happened. Something Mark didn't know about yet. An email, a phone call. An opportunity that had quietly been building for months. I closed my laptop slowly. I see, I said. Mark raised an eyebrow. That's it? He asked. You're not going to argue? I stood up and carried the pan from the stove to the sink. No, I said calmly. Water began running as I turned on the faucet. I don't think there's anything to argue about. Mark laughed again, clearly satisfied with himself. Good, he said. Because sometimes you need to hear the truth. Maybe he was right. Sometimes people do need to hear the truth. What Mark didn't realize was that the next morning, I was going to show him mine. The next morning started quietly. No arguments, no dramatic goodbye, just the soft sound of the coffee machine humming in the kitchen and the pale gray light of early morning slipping through the blinds. Mark always left for work at 7:15. That routine had never changed. He came into the kitchen wearing his usual navy suit, adjusting the cuff of his watch while scanning emails on his phone. I was already sitting at the table with my laptop open. You're up early, he said casually, pouring himself coffee. I have a call this morning, I replied. He barely looked up. Freelance thing? Yes, I said. That was technically true, just not the whole truth. Mark took a sip of coffee and grabbed his car keys from the counter. Well, he said, heading toward the door. Good luck with that. He paused before leaving and glanced back at me. You know what I said last night, he added. I wasn't trying to be mean. I just want you to be realistic. I nodded once. I understand. Satisfied, he left. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. For a few seconds, the house was completely silent. Then I looked down at the email on my screen again. Subject line. Offer letter. Bright Path Digital Strategy. I had read it at least 10 times already. Not because I didn't believe it, but because part of me still hadn't fully accepted that the opportunity was real. 3 months earlier, one of my freelance clients had referred me to a consulting group that worked with mid-sized businesses struggling with digital marketing strategies. At first, they just needed help with one project, a small campaign redesign, nothing dramatic. But that project turned into another, and another, until eventually one of the senior partners asked me a simple question during a video call. Have you ever considered doing this full-time? At the time, I had laughed it off. Full-time meant leaving the safe routine of the life I already had. But over the next few weeks, they kept calling. More projects, bigger responsibilities. And eventually, yesterday afternoon, the offer. Senior strategy consultant. Remote. Full autonomy over several regional clients. The starting salary alone was more than my freelance work had made in an entire year. But the money wasn't the part that had kept me awake last night. It was something else. Respect. The kind that doesn't need to be asked for. At exactly 8:01 a.m., my phone buzzed. Incoming call. Daniel Price, Bright Path. I took a breath and answered. Good morning, Claire, Daniel said warmly. Good morning. Did you have a chance to review everything? Yes, I replied. A brief pause followed. Then he asked the question I already knew was coming. So, what do you think? For a moment, I glanced around the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had spent years making sure everything in this house worked smoothly. The same kitchen where my husband had said I wouldn't survive without him. I returned my attention to the call. I accept, I said. Daniel laughed. Lightly. That's great to hear. We're excited to have you. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing onboarding details, client transitions, and the timeline for my first strategy presentation. When the call ended, I closed my laptop slowly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something shift, not relief, something stronger. Clarity. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown to open a new bank account, not because Mark controlled our finances, but because I realized something important. If I was going to build my own future, I needed to start making decisions like it already belonged to me. The next few days passed without much change. Mark went to work. I worked on my new projects. At night, we had dinner like usual. But something inside me had already moved forward. Mark just didn't know it yet. On Thursday evening, he came home unusually irritated. He dropped his briefcase on the table and loosened his tie. "You wouldn't believe the meeting I had today," he said. "What happened?" "One of our clients is pulling back on a development project," he said, rubbing his forehead. "It's going to cost us months of planning." "That sounds stressful." "It is," he replied, "which is why I don't understand why you keep putting energy into those little side projects." I looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed. "Claire, I'm serious. You should focus on the house right now. My job is going to require more time over the next few months." There it was again, that quiet assumption, the one where my goals always came second. I folded my hands on the table. "Actually," I said calmly, "I've been meaning to talk to you about that." Mark glanced up. "About what?" I stood and walked to the counter where my laptop sat. Then I turned the screen toward him. The Bright Path contract was open. Mark leaned forward slightly. "What is this?" "It's a job offer," I said. He frowned. "For freelance work?" "No." I watched his expression carefully. "It's a full-time consulting position." The room went quiet. Mark stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You're not serious." "I am." He gave a short laugh. "Claire, come on. You've never worked in a real corporate environment." "That's exactly what the job is," I said calmly. "Strategic consulting." Mark shook his head slowly. "You're jumping into something you don't understand." "Actually," I replied, "I've been doing this work for months." He looked at me differently now. Not dismissive. Confused. "So what are you saying?" he asked. I met his eyes. "I'm saying I accepted the offer." Silence filled the kitchen. Mark stared at me as if he were trying to process something that didn't fit his understanding of the world. Then he said quietly, "And what happens to this house?" I didn't hesitate. "I'm moving out next month." For the first time in years, Mark had absolutely nothing to say. Mark blinked once like he had misheard me. "You're what?" His voice wasn't angry yet, just confused. "I'm moving out next month," I repeated calmly. For a moment, he just stared at me, waiting for the part where I laughed and admitted it was a joke. But that moment never came. He leaned forward slowly, elbows on the table. "Claire, you're not serious." "I am." The room felt strangely quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in our front yard, their shadows sliding slowly across the kitchen floor. Mark rubbed his forehead. "Okay," he said carefully. "Let's slow down for a second." I didn't interrupt. He stood up and walked toward the counter, pouring himself another glass of bourbon. It was barely 6 in the evening. "That job offer," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the laptop. "You're getting carried away. These consulting firms promise things all the time." "They already signed the contract," I replied. Mark took a sip and shook his head. "Claire, you've never handled corporate clients at that level." I didn't respond. He turned toward me again. "You're making a mistake." There it was, the certainty in his voice. The same certainty he had used the night before when he said I wouldn't survive without him. "I don't think so," I said. Mark laughed quietly. "You think you're just going to pack a bag, move into some apartment, and suddenly build a career?" I folded my hands together. "I already signed the lease." That made him stop, completely. "What?" "It's a small place downtown," I said. "Close to where most of the Bright Path clients are based." Mark stared at me like I had just started speaking a different language. "You planned this." "No," I said calmly. "This week I did." For several seconds he didn't move. Then he set the glass down harder than he probably intended. "So that's it?" he asked. 15 years and you're just leaving?" The question sounded emotional, but something about it felt misplaced, as if the problem wasn't the marriage. It was the inconvenience. "I'm not leaving." "Because of 15 years," I said quietly. "Then why?" I looked at him, because sometimes the answer is obvious long before anyone says it out loud. Because you don't believe in me, I said. Mark scoffed. That's not true. Last night you said I wouldn't survive without you. That's not what I meant. You said it exactly like that. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, he looked genuinely frustrated. Claire, I provide this house. I handle the finances. I built stability for us. I know you did, I said. And you think walking away from that is smart? I didn't raise my voice. I think staying somewhere I'm not respected isn't. That landed harder than anything else I had said. Mark looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. Then he laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded different, more defensive. You're going to regret this, he said. Maybe, maybe not. But something inside me had already moved past the point where regret controlled the decision. I don't think I will, I said. Mark grabbed his glass and walked into the living room. The conversation ended there, not with yelling, not with slammed doors, just silence. Over the next 3 weeks, we lived in the same house like two people slowly preparing for separate lives. Mark barely mentioned my new job again. At first, I thought he was avoiding the topic. Later, I realized something else. He didn't believe I would actually go through with it. Every morning, he still left for work at the same time. Every evening, he came home expecting the routine to remain the same. Dinner, television, occasional comments about how stressful his projects were becoming. But he never asked about my work, never asked about BrightPath, never asked about the apartment. It was as if ignoring it might make the situation disappear. Meanwhile, my days looked very different. BrightPath moved quickly. Within the first week, I was assigned 2 major clients. One was a retail distribution company trying to rebuild its digital infrastructure. The other was a manufacturing firm expanding into 3 new markets. The work was intense, but something about it felt natural, like stepping into a role I had been preparing for quietly for years. 3 weeks later, moving day arrived. The apartment wasn't large, just a 1-bedroom with big windows and a small balcony overlooking the downtown streets. But when the movers carried in the last box and left, the silence inside that apartment felt different. Not lonely. Free. That evening, my phone buzzed. Mark. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello? His voice sounded slightly irritated. You actually moved? Yes. You didn't think maybe we should talk about this more? We did talk about it. Not seriously. I leaned against the balcony railing, looking out at the city lights. Mark, I told you exactly what I was doing. He exhaled sharply. This consulting job isn't permanent. I know. So what happens when it doesn't work out? There it was again. The assumption that failure was inevitable. I'll figure it out, I said. Mark was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something that almost made me smile. You'll be calling me in a month. Maybe, maybe not. But what Mark didn't know was that something much bigger was already beginning to happen. Not with me, with him. The first month passed faster than I expected. New routines have a strange way of doing that. They keep your mind busy enough that you don't notice how much your life has changed until one day you suddenly stop and realize nothing looks the same anymore. My apartment slowly began to feel like home. A small desk by the window became my workspace. The balcony became my morning coffee spot. And for the first time in years, every decision about my daily life belonged entirely to me. BrightPath moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, I was leading strategy meetings with 2 major clients. Daniel trusted me with responsibilities most new consultants usually didn't get for months. One afternoon after a presentation call, he stayed on the line. You know, he said thoughtfully, the retail group you're working with just expanded their contract. That's good news. It is, he replied, but they asked something interesting. What was that? They specifically requested you stay on the account long term. I leaned back in my chair. Really? Daniel laughed softly. Apparently, the previous consultants kept giving them the same generic strategies. You actually listened to their logistics problems. Listening, it sounded simple, but after years of managing a household where my ideas were often dismissed, being heard in a professional setting felt almost surreal. Meanwhile, Mark's confidence hadn't changed, at least not at first. About 3 weeks after I moved out, he texted me one evening. "Mark, how's the consulting empire going?" I could almost hear the sarcasm through the screen. I responded simply, "Me. Busy." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Mark, you still settling in?" I knew what he was really asking. "Are you struggling yet?" I didn't bother explaining how many hours I had spent working with international clients that week. Instead, I replied, "Me. Everything's going well." He didn't answer after that. 2 months later, something unexpected happened. I was in the middle of reviewing a supply chain analytics report when Daniel walked into my office holding a printed document. "You might find this interesting," he said. I looked up. "What is it?" He placed the paper on my desk. The headline immediately caught my attention. "Local development firm faces major investor withdrawal." I recognized the company name instantly. It was the real estate firm Mark worked for. I read the article quickly. The firm had been planning a large commercial development project outside the city. According to the report, one of their biggest investors had suddenly pulled out of the deal. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "Do you know anyone over there?" he asked casually. I hesitated for a moment. "My husband works there," I said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Worked," I corrected. "Ah." He nodded slowly. "That explains the look on your face." The article didn't mention layoffs yet, but anyone who had worked around business long enough knew what usually followed major investor withdrawals. Projects stalled, budgets tightened, and sometimes people lost their jobs. I folded the paper and set it aside. "I hope things work out for them," I said quietly. Daniel studied me for a moment. "You're nicer than most people would be in that situation." Maybe. Or maybe I simply understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Other people's mistakes eventually create their own consequences. You don't need to rush the process. 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was walking home from the office. Mark. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a month. I answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded different this time, less confident. "Hey." "Hi." A pause followed. Then he said quietly, "Things got complicated at work." I leaned against the brick wall of a cafe and waited. "Our development project collapsed," he continued. "The company's cutting departments. And they laid off half the management team this morning." I understood what that meant before he finished the sentence. "I'm sorry," I said honestly. Mark let out a slow breath. "For now, they kept me," he added quickly. "But everything's uncertain." Another pause. Then he asked the question I think he had been avoiding for months. "How's your job going?" I looked up at the tall office buildings glowing against the evening sky. Busy streets, people walking past. A life I had built one decision at a time. "It's going really well," I said. He didn't respond right away, and in that silence, something shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel it. For the first time since the night he told me I couldn't survive without him. Mark sounded unsure. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear traffic moving in the background on Mark's end of the call. The faint hum of cars, a distant horn, the kind of ordinary sounds that fill the silence when someone doesn't quite know what to say next. "So, things are good for you?" he asked finally. "Yes," I said. I kept my voice calm. Not defensive, not proud, just honest. Another pause followed. Then Mark cleared his throat. "That consulting job, it's stable?" The question sounded careful, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "It is," I replied. "We just signed 2 new client contracts last week." "Oh." The word came out quieter than I expected. For years, Mark had always been the one with the stable career, the confident one, the person who understood how the professional world worked, and suddenly, that balance had shifted. "I'm glad it worked out," he said. I could tell he meant it, at least partly, but there was something else in his voice too, something that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. We talked for another minute or two about neutral things. Weather, the city traffic, nothing important. Then the conversation ended. But that phone call wasn't the last time I heard from him. A few weeks later, BrightPath held a regional strategy conference for several of our larger clients. It was a 3-day event hosted in one of the downtown hotels. The ballroom was filled with business owners, consultants, and corporate managers from across the region. By the second afternoon, I had already led 2 presentations and participated in a panel discussion about digital expansion strategies. As I stepped out into the lobby to grab a coffee, someone said my name. Claire? I turned. And for a second, I didn't recognize him. Not because Mark had changed dramatically, but because I had never seen him in this environment before. He was standing near the entrance to the conference hall, wearing the same navy suit he used to wear to work every day. But his expression was different, less certain. "Hi," he said. "Hi." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "My company sent a few of us to attend the conference," he said. "We're trying to rebuild some investor relationships." That made sense. Events like this often brought together companies looking for partnerships. Mark glanced around the lobby. "You're speaking here?" "I led 2 sessions earlier today." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Really?" "Yes." Another quiet moment passed between us. Then he said something that surprised me. "I watched the end of your panel." "You did?" He nodded. "You sounded confident." I smiled a little. "Thank you." Mark shifted his weight slightly. "You always were smart," he said. "I guess I just didn't see where it could go." I didn't answer right away. Not because I was angry, but because I realized something important in that moment. Mark wasn't trying to defend himself anymore. He was trying to understand. "You once told me I wouldn't survive without you," I said gently. He looked down at the floor for a second. "I remember." I believed that for a long time. Mark looked back up. "And now?" I thought about the apartment, the job, the clients who trusted my work, the life I had built quietly, step by step. "Now I know something different," I said. "What?" "That surviving and living are 2 different things." Mark nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I underestimated you." Maybe that was the closest thing to an apology he could offer, and strangely, it was enough, because I wasn't standing there hoping he would understand anymore. I had already moved forward. A few minutes later, someone from BrightPath waved me over from across the lobby. "Claire, the next session's starting." I glanced back at Mark. "I should go." "Yeah," he said. "Of course." I started walking toward the conference room, then he said one more thing. "Claire?" I turned. "You proved me wrong." I smiled slightly, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, just with the quiet certainty that comes when you finally understand your own worth. Outside the tall glass windows of the hotel, the city moved the way cities always do. People walking, businesses growing, decisions being made every second. Life continuing. Because the truth is something many people eventually learn the hard way. Titles can change. Circumstances can change. Relationships can even fall apart. But the belief you have in yourself, that's the one thing no one else gets to control. And once you realize that, everything else becomes possible. A few months passed after that conference. Life settled into a rhythm that felt steady, almost peaceful. My work at BrightPath kept expanding. New clients, new strategies, new projects that challenged me in ways I had quietly hoped for years earlier. Every morning I walked into the office, knowing something simple but powerful. I belonged there. Not because someone allowed it, because I earned it. My apartment slowly filled with small reminders of the life I had built on my own terms. A bookshelf near the window, a framed photo from the BrightPath conference, a whiteboard covered in strategy notes and client timelines. Nothing extravagant, just proof of a life that was moving forward. Occasionally, I would hear small updates about Mark through mutual friends. His company had recovered slightly after the failed development project, but things were still uncertain. Several departments had been reorganized, and the firm had lost a few major investors. From what I understood, Mark was working longer hours than ever, trying to stabilize things, trying to rebuild momentum. I didn't feel angry when I heard those updates, just distant. Sometimes people assume stories like this end with revenge, but the truth is, real life rarely works that way. It ends with distance and growth. About 6 months after the conference, I ran into Mark again unexpectedly. This time it wasn't at a business event, it was at a grocery store. I was standing in the produce aisle comparing 2 bags of oranges when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Claire? I turned. Mark looked almost the same as the last time I saw him, but there were small differences you only notice when you've known someone for years. A little more tired, a little more thoughtful. Hi, I said. Hi. We both laughed quietly at the coincidence. Didn't expect to run into you here, he said. Neither did I. We stood there, awkwardly for a moment beside the fruit display. Then Mark asked, "How's work?" "Busy," I said. "But good. I saw something online about your company expanding to the West Coast." "We are." "That's impressive." He said it sincerely, not like before. Not like someone making a polite comment they didn't fully believe. Like someone who had accepted the reality of it. "And you?" I asked. Mark shrugged slightly. "Still working through the fallout from that project collapse." "Is the company stable?" "For now," he said. "But things changed a lot after that." Another quiet pause followed. Then Mark said something I hadn't expected. "You know, I've thought a lot about that night in the kitchen." I didn't interrupt. "The night I said you wouldn't survive without me." I nodded slightly. "I remember." He looked down at the shopping cart for a second. "That was a terrible thing to say." "Yes," I said gently. "I think I believed it because it made me feel important," he admitted. Like my success meant something if someone else depended on it. His honesty surprised me. "People do that sometimes," I said. Mark looked back up. "You didn't argue that night," he said. "You just accepted it." I realized something. "What? That arguing wouldn't change your mind." "And leaving did." "Eventually," I said. Mark smiled faintly. "I guess it did." We stood there quietly for another moment before he glanced at the oranges in my hand. "You always liked those," he said. "Still do." "Well," he said, pushing his cart slightly forward, "I should let you finish shopping." "Good. Seeing you, Mark." "You too." He walked toward the next aisle, then paused and turned back. "Claire?" "Yes?" "I'm glad you proved me wrong." I smiled. Not because I needed to hear it anymore, but because sometimes closure doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches or perfect apologies. Sometimes it arrives in small, ordinary moments. A conversation in a grocery store, a quiet acknowledgement, a simple sentence that finally puts the past where it belongs, behind you. As I walked toward the checkout counter a few minutes later, I thought about how much life can change from one decision, one night, one moment where someone tells you what they believe you're capable of, and you choose not to accept it. Because the truth is, many people will try to define your limits. Sometimes they do it out of fear, sometimes out of habit, sometimes without even realizing it. But the most important thing anyone can learn is this. Your future is never decided by the person who doubts you. It's decided by the moment you stop doubting yourself. And once that moment arrives, you don't just survive, you build something better. About a year after I moved out, something happened that made me realize just how far my life had come. Not because of a big promotion, not because of money, but because of a moment I never expected. BrightPath had just finished its most successful quarter since the company started. Several of the clients I worked with had expanded their contracts, and the leadership team was planning to open a second regional office. One Monday morning, Daniel called me into his office. He had that same thoughtful look he usually wore when he was about to discuss something important. "Claire," he said, leaning back in his chair, "how long have you been with us now?" "Almost a year." "Feels shorter than that." I smiled slightly. "It's been a busy year." "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you," he replied. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a proposal document. At the top of the page was a title I hadn't expected. Regional Strategy Director, West Coast Division. I looked up at him. You're serious? We are, Daniel said. The partners have been discussing it for weeks. The truth is, a lot of our recent growth came directly from the systems and client relationships you've built. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Not because I wasn't excited, but because I remembered something very clearly. A kitchen. Table. A quiet evening. A sentence someone once said with complete certainty. You wouldn't last a week without me. Daniel watched my reaction. Too much responsibility? He asked. No, I said slowly. Just unexpected. Well, he said with a grin, you've made a habit of surprising people. Later that afternoon, I walked back to my office holding the folder. Outside the window, the city looked the same as it always did. Traffic moving through intersections, people hurrying down sidewalks, businesses opening and closing. But for me, everything felt different, because the life I was living now wasn't something anyone had given me. I built it, piece by piece, decision by decision. A few weeks later, BrightPath hosted another client networking event at the same downtown hotel where I had spoken months earlier. The ballroom was filled with familiar faces, consultants, executives, entrepreneurs. As I walked through the room greeting people, someone tapped lightly on my shoulder. Claire? I turned. Mark stood there again. This time he looked calmer, more relaxed than the last time I saw him. Hi, I said. Hi. He gestured around the ballroom. Looks like your world got even bigger. I smiled. It's growing. I heard about your promotion, he said. News travels fast. Someone at my company mentioned it. That didn't surprise me. Professional circles often overlap in ways people don't expect. Mark looked around the room for a moment before speaking again. You know, he said thoughtfully, when you first moved out, I kept waiting. Waiting for what? For you to call and say, it wasn't working. And, he shrugged lightly, that call never came. No, I said, it didn't. He studied my expression for a moment. I used to think confidence came from having control over things, he said. What do you think now? That it comes from trusting yourself. I nodded slowly. That sounds about right. For a few seconds, we both watched the crowd moving around the ballroom. Then Mark said something that felt like the final piece of a long conversation. You didn't just prove me wrong, he said. You proved something to yourself. Maybe he was right, because the truth was, the most important part of my story wasn't the moment he doubted me. It was the moment I stopped needing his belief. A few minutes later, someone from the BrightPath team called my name from across the room. Claire, the investors are ready for the presentation. I glanced back at Mark. I should go. He nodded. Of course. As I walked toward the stage, I heard him say one last thing behind me. I hope you know something. I turned slightly. What's that? You didn't just survive. He smiled faintly. You built a life most people are still trying to figure out. I returned the smile and stepped toward the stage lights. Because in the end, stories like this aren't really about proving someone else wrong. They're about discovering something much more important. Your value was never determined by the person who doubted you. It was determined the moment you decided to believe in yourself. And once you reach that moment, everything changes. A few weeks after that event, life continued the way it does when things are finally in balance. Busy mornings, strategy meetings, late evenings reviewing proposals. The new role as regional strategy director meant I spent more time leading teams, instead of just managing projects. At first, the responsibility felt heavier than anything I had done before. But something interesting happens when you grow into your own confidence. The pressure stops feeling like a burden. It starts feeling like momentum. One afternoon, I was finishing a call with a new client when my assistant knocked lightly on my office door. Claire, there's someone here to see you. I looked up from my desk. Do they have an appointment? No, she said, but he said you might want to talk to him. Who is it? She hesitated for a second. Mark. I paused, not because I was nervous, just surprised. Send him in, I said. A moment later, Mark stepped into the office. He looked around slowly, taking in the space. The glass walls, the whiteboard filled with strategy notes, the team photos from company events. "You've done well," he said. "Thank you." He sat across from my desk, folding his hands together. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted. "What made you decide to?" He leaned back slightly. "Curiosity, I guess." "About what?" "About how someone rebuilds their life that quickly." I smiled a little. "It wasn't quick." No, I said. "It just looked that way from the outside." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something unexpected. "I left the company." "You did? Last week? What happened?" He shrugged lightly. "After everything that happened with the development projects, I realized something." "What?" "I had built my entire identity around a job title." I understood that feeling more than he probably realized. "And when the company started falling apart," he continued, "so did my sense of control." "That's hard," I said. "It is," he admitted. "But it also forced me to ask a question I hadn't asked in years." Which was, what do I actually want to do with my life? That was not the version of Mark I had known during our marriage. That version believed the path was already decided. Career, status, stability, end of story. "So what did you decide?" I asked. "I'm starting a smaller consulting firm with 2 colleagues." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Consulting?" He laughed quietly. "Yeah, ironic, right?" "A little." "But after watching what you built," he said, "I realized something." "What's that?" "Sometimes the safest life is the one that keeps you stuck." The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Then he stood. "I didn't come here to reopen old chapters," he said. "I figured. I just wanted to say something in person." "What?" Mark looked directly at me. "You changed the way I think about risk." I considered that for a moment. "That's not something I expected." "Me neither," he said. Then he smiled slightly. "But life has a funny way of doing that." He walked toward the door, then paused. "You know," he added, "if someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be the one starting over, I would have laughed. And now I understand something." "What?" "That starting over isn't failure." I nodded slowly. "No," I said. "It isn't." Mark gave a small nod of appreciation and left the office. The door closed quietly behind him. I sat at my desk for a moment afterward, thinking about how strange life can be. 2 years earlier, I had been sitting at a kitchen table listening to someone explain why I wouldn't survive without them. Now we were 2 completely different people walking completely different paths. Not enemies, not even really connected anymore. Just 2 people who had learned different lessons from the same moment. Later that evening, as I turned off the lights in my office, I looked out across the city again. The same streets, the same buildings, but a completely different life. And I realized something simple. The most powerful decision you can ever make isn't proving someone wrong. It's refusing to let their doubt decide your future. Because the moment you stop living inside someone else's expectations, you finally begin building a life that actually belongs to you.